The courtroom was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Everyone sat still, waiting for the next case to be called. The judge, a woman in her late 40s with a calm but firm presence, sat at the bench, reviewing the files in front of her. She had seen many cases over the years, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen. A young boy, no older than 10, was brought into the room by a social worker. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room as he clutched a small teddy bear. His clothes were clean but slightly worn, and his shoes scuffed from what seemed like a long journey. The boy's case was one of many that day, a custody hearing to determine where he would live after being removed from his parents' care due to neglect. The judge looked up from her papers and smiled gently at the boy, trying to put him at ease. "Good morning," she said in a soft but authoritative voice. "Can you tell me your name?" The boy hesitated, his grip tightening on the teddy bear. He glanced at the social worker, who gave him an encouraging nod. Finally, he whispered, "My name is, He paused, then looked directly at the judge and said something that made everyone in the room freeze. "Mom?" The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. The judge's eyes widened, and she leaned forward, her composure slipping for just a moment. The social worker gasped, and the few people in the gallery exchanged shocked glances. The boy, realizing what he had just said, quickly looked down at his feet, his face turning red. The judge, recovering from the initial shock, took a deep breath. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with curiosity. The boy didn't answer. He just stood there, fidgeting with the teddy bear, clearly embarrassed. The social worker stepped forward, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your Honor, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This boy has been through a lot, and he's been moved around quite a bit. He might be confused." But the judge wasn't so sure. There was something in the boy's voice, something in the way he had looked at her, that felt familiar. She studied him for a moment, her mind racing. Could it be possible? Was there a chance? "Let's take a short recess," she said, standing up abruptly. "I need a moment to review the case file more closely." As she left the bench, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. No one had ever seen the judge react like that before. She was known for her professionalism, her ability to remain calm under pressure. But this was different. In her chambers, the judge sat down and opened the boy's file. She read through it carefully, her heart pounding as she turned each page. The boy had been in foster care for the past 2 years, moving from one home to another. His parents had struggled with addiction and had lost custody of him. There were no photos in the file. No mention of any relatives who could take him in. But as she read, something caught her eye. The boy's birth date. It was the same as, no, it couldn't be. She quickly pulled out her phone and scrolled through old photos. There it was, a picture of her holding a baby, years ago. A baby she had given up for adoption when she was young, before she had gone to law school, before her life had taken the path it had. Her hands trembled as she put the phone down. Could this boy really be her son? The son she had thought about every single day but had never been able to find? She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She needed to be sure. When she returned to the courtroom, the boy was still standing there, looking small and scared. The judge sat down and looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Young man," she said gently, "can you look at me?" The boy slowly raised his head, his eyes meeting hers. And in that moment, she knew. She just knew. Those eyes, they were the same as hers. The same shape, the same color. It was like looking into a mirror. "What's your mother's name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy hesitated, then said, "I don't know. I never met her. But I think it's you." The room fell silent again, everyone holding their breath. The judge felt a lump in her throat, but she forced herself to stay composed. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the boy, her son, and what was best for him. "We'll need to do a DNA test to be sure," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "But if it's true, if you're really my son, then I promise you this, you'll never have to be alone again." The boy's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded slowly. The judge felt her own eyes welling up, but she quickly blinked the tears away. She had to stay strong, for him. As the bailiff led the boy out of the courtroom, the judge sat back in her chair, her mind racing. How had this happened? How had her son ended up here, in her courtroom, after all these years? And what would happen next? She didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear: this was just the beginning of a story that would change both of their lives forever. The judge sat in her chambers long after the courtroom had emptied. Her hands were still trembling as she stared at the boy's file, now spread out across her desk. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, and she felt a mix of emotions she hadn't experienced in years: hope, fear, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She had always wondered what had happened to the child she had given up for adoption so many years ago. And now, here he was, standing in her courtroom, calling her Mom. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in a long time. It rang a few times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello? It's me," the judge said, her voice shaky. "I need your help." The voice on the other end belonged to an old friend, someone who had been with her during the most difficult time of her life, when she had made the heart-wrenching decision to give her baby up for adoption. Her friend had been her rock back then, and now, she needed that support again. "What's wrong?" the friend asked, sensing the urgency in her voice. The judge took a deep breath. I think I just found him. My son. He's here, in my courtroom. He called me Mom." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" the friend finally asked. "No," the judge admitted. "Not yet. But I'm going to find out. I need to know for sure." After hanging up, the judge made a few more calls. She arranged for a DNA test to be done as quickly as possible. She also reached out to the boy's social worker to get more information about his background. The social worker, still visibly shaken by what had happened in the courtroom, agreed to meet with her later that day. Meanwhile, the boy was taken to a temporary foster home. He sat quietly in the back seat of the social worker's car, clutching his teddy bear. He didn't say much, but his mind was racing. He had always wondered about his mother, about where she was and why she had given him up. And now, he had seen her. She was real. She was a judge. And she had looked at him with so much emotion in her eyes that it made his heart ache. When they arrived at the foster home, the boy was greeted by a kind woman who had cared for many children over the years. She could tell right away that something was different about this boy. He seemed lost in thought, his usual curiosity replaced by a quiet intensity. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked, kneeling down to his level. The boy nodded, but his eyes told a different story. "I think I found my mom," he said softly. The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? That's wonderful. Where is she?" "In the courtroom," the boy replied. "She's the judge." The woman didn't know what to say. She had heard many stories in her years as a foster parent, but nothing like this. She gave the boy a warm hug and promised to help him in any way she could. Back at the courthouse, the judge was meeting with the social worker. The two women sat in a small conference room, the boy's file open on the table between them. "Tell me everything you know about him," the judge said, her voice calm but firm. The social worker nodded and began to explain. The boy had been in the system for 2 years, moving from one foster home to another. His parents had struggled with addiction and had been unable to care for him. There were no other relatives willing or able to take him in. He was a bright boy, but he had been through a lot, and it showed in his behavior. He was quiet, reserved, and often kept to himself. "He's a good kid," the social worker said. "But he's been through more than any child should have to go through." The voice on the other end belonged to an old friend, someone who had been with her during the most difficult time of her life, when she had made the heart-wrenching decision to give her baby up for adoption. Her friend had been her rock back then, and now, she needed that support again. "What's wrong?" the friend asked, sensing the urgency in her voice. The judge took a deep breath. I think I just found him. My son. He's here, in my courtroom. He called me Mom." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" the friend finally asked. "No," the judge admitted. "Not yet. But I'm going to find out. I need to know for sure." After hanging up, the judge made a few more calls. She arranged for a DNA test to be done as quickly as possible. She also reached out to the boy's social worker to get more information about his background. The social worker, still visibly shaken by what had happened in the courtroom, agreed to meet with her later that day. Meanwhile, the boy was taken to a temporary foster home. He sat quietly in the back seat of the social worker's car, clutching his teddy bear. He didn't say much, but his mind was racing. He had always wondered about his mother, about where she was and why she had given him up. And now, he had seen her. She was real. She was a judge. And she had looked at him with so much emotion in her eyes that it made his heart ache. When they arrived at the foster home, the boy was greeted by a kind woman who had cared for many children over the years. She could tell right away that something was different about this boy. He seemed lost in thought, his usual curiosity replaced by a quiet intensity. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked, kneeling down to his level. The boy nodded, but his eyes told a different story. "I think I found my mom," he said softly. The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? That's wonderful. Where is she?" "In the courtroom," the boy replied. "She's the judge." The woman didn't know what to say. She had heard many stories in her years as a foster parent, but nothing like this. She gave the boy a warm hug and promised to help him in any way she could. Back at the courthouse, the judge was meeting with the social worker. The two women sat in a small conference room, the boy's file open on the table between them. "Tell me everything you know about him," the judge said, her voice calm but firm. The social worker nodded and began to explain. The boy had been in the system for 2 years, moving from one foster home to another. His parents had struggled with addiction and had been unable to care for him. There were no other relatives willing or able to take him in. He was a bright boy, but he had been through a lot, and it showed in his behavior. He was quiet, reserved, and often kept to himself. "He's a good kid," the social worker said. "But he's been through more than any child should have to go through." The voice on the other end belonged to an old friend, someone who had been with her during the most difficult time of her life, when she had made the heart-wrenching decision to give her baby up for adoption. Her friend had been her rock back then, and now, she needed that support again. "What's wrong?" the friend asked, sensing the urgency in her voice. The judge took a deep breath. I think I just found him. My son. He's here, in my courtroom. He called me Mom." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" the friend finally asked. "No," the judge admitted. "Not yet. But I'm going to find out. I need to know for sure." After hanging up, the judge made a few more calls. She arranged for a DNA test to be done as quickly as possible. She also reached out to the boy's social worker to get more information about his background. The social worker, still visibly shaken by what had happened in the courtroom, agreed to meet with her later that day. Meanwhile, the boy was taken to a temporary foster home. He sat quietly in the back seat of the social worker's car, clutching his teddy bear. He didn't say much, but his mind was racing. He had always wondered about his mother, about where she was and why she had given him up. And now, he had seen her. She was real. She was a judge. And she had looked at him with so much emotion in her eyes that it made his heart ache. When they arrived at the foster home, the boy was greeted by a kind woman who had cared for many children over the years. She could tell right away that something was different about this boy. He seemed lost in thought, his usual curiosity replaced by a quiet intensity. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked, kneeling down to his level. The boy nodded, but his eyes told a different story. "I think I found my mom," he said softly. The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? That's wonderful. Where is she?" "In the courtroom," the boy replied. "She's the judge." The woman didn't know what to say. She had heard many stories in her years as a foster parent, but nothing like this. She gave the boy a warm hug and promised to help him in any way she could. Back at the courthouse, the judge was meeting with the social worker. The two women sat in a small conference room, the boy's file open on the table between them. "Tell me everything you know about him," the judge said, her voice calm but firm. The social worker nodded and began to explain. The boy had been in the system for 2 years, moving from one foster home to another. His parents had struggled with addiction and had been unable to care for him. There were no other relatives willing or able to take him in. He was a bright boy, but he had been through a lot, and it showed in his behavior. He was quiet, reserved, and often kept to himself. "He's a good kid," the social worker said. "But he's been through more than any child should have to go through." The voice on the other end belonged to an old friend, someone who had been with her during the most difficult time of her life, when she had made the heart-wrenching decision to give her baby up for adoption. Her friend had been her rock back then, and now, she needed that support again. "What's wrong?" the friend asked, sensing the urgency in her voice. The judge took a deep breath. I think I just found him. My son. He's here, in my courtroom. He called me Mom." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" the friend finally asked. "No," the judge admitted. "Not yet. But I'm going to find out. I need to know for sure." After hanging up, the judge made a few more calls. She arranged for a DNA test to be done as quickly as possible. She also reached out to the boy's social worker to get more information about his background. The social worker, still visibly shaken by what had happened in the courtroom, agreed to meet with her later that day. Meanwhile, the boy was taken to a temporary foster home. He sat quietly in the back seat of the social worker's car, clutching his teddy bear. He didn't say much, but his mind was racing. He had always wondered about his mother, about where she was and why she had given him up. And now, he had seen her. She was real. She was a judge. And she had looked at him with so much emotion in her eyes that it made his heart ache. When they arrived at the foster home, the boy was greeted by a kind woman who had cared for many children over the years. She could tell right away that something was different about this boy. He seemed lost in thought, his usual curiosity replaced by a quiet intensity. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked, kneeling down to his level. The boy nodded, but his eyes told a different story. "I think I found my mom," he said softly. The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? That's wonderful. Where is she?" "In the courtroom," the boy replied. "She's the judge." The woman didn't know what to say. She had heard many stories in her years as a foster parent, but nothing like this. She gave the boy a warm hug and promised to help him in any way she could. Back at the courthouse, the judge was meeting with the social worker. The two women sat in a small conference room, the boy's file open on the table between them. "Tell me everything you know about him," the judge said, her voice calm but firm. The social worker nodded and began to explain. The boy had been in the system for 2 years, moving from one foster home to another. His parents had struggled with addiction and had been unable to care for him. There were no other relatives willing or able to take him in. He was a bright boy, but he had been through a lot, and it showed in his behavior. He was quiet, reserved, and often kept to himself. The days following the courtroom incident felt like an eternity for both the judge and the boy. The DNA test had been scheduled, but the results would take time. In the meantime, life went on, but it was impossible for either of them to focus on anything else. The boy stayed in the foster home, his mind filled with questions and hopes he couldn't quite put into words. The judge, on the other hand, found herself distracted during court hearings, her thoughts constantly drifting back to the boy and the possibility that he was her son. The judge decided to visit the boy at his foster home. She knew it was unusual for a judge to get personally involved in a case like this, but she couldn't help herself. She needed to see him again, to talk to him, to try to understand what he was feeling. She also wanted to reassure him that, no matter what the DNA test revealed, she cared about him and wanted to help. When she arrived at the foster home, the boy was sitting on the porch, his teddy bear in his lap. He looked up as she approached, his eyes wide with surprise. The judge smiled gently and sat down beside him. "Hi," she said softly. "How are you doing?" The boy shrugged, his fingers nervously playing with the teddy bear's ear. "I'm okay," he mumbled. The judge nodded, understanding that he might not want to talk much. She didn't push him. Instead, she sat quietly beside him, letting the silence stretch between them. After a few minutes, the boy spoke up. "Are you really my mom?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The judge's heart ached at the question. She wished she could give him a definite answer, but she couldn't, not yet. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I want to find out, just as much as you do. And no matter what happens, I want you to know that I care about you." The boy looked at her, his eyes searching hers for something, reassurance, maybe, or hope. He didn't say anything, but he scooted a little closer to her, as if seeking comfort in her presence. They sat like that for a while, the judge telling him little stories about her life and asking him about his favorite things. She learned that he loved animals, especially dogs, and that he wanted to be a veterinarian when he grew up. She also learned that he had a favorite color, blue, and that he liked to draw, even though he didn't think he was very good at it. As the sun began to set, the judge knew it was time to go. She stood up and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'll come back soon, okay?" she said. "And as soon as we get the test results, we'll figure everything out together." The boy nodded, his eyes still fixed on her. "Okay," he said quietly. As she walked back to her car, the judge felt a mix of emotions. She was hopeful, but also scared. What if the test results came back negative? What if this boy wasn't her son after all? She didn't know if she could handle the disappointment. But at the same time, she knew that even if he wasn't her biological child, she still wanted to be a part of his life. He needed someone, and she was determined to be that person. Back at her office, the judge threw herself into her work, trying to distract herself from the waiting. But no matter how many cases she reviewed or how many hearings she presided over, her mind kept drifting back to the boy. She found herself thinking about his future, about what she could do to help him, regardless of the DNA results. A few days later, the social worker called. "The results are in," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of excitement. "Can you come to the office?" The judge's heart raced as she drove to the social worker's office. She tried to prepare herself for whatever the results might be, but it was impossible. Her hands were shaking as she walked into the building, and she felt like she could barely breathe. The social worker greeted her with a warm smile and led her to a small room. On the table was a sealed envelope containing the DNA test results. The judge stared at it, her mind racing. "Do you want me to open it?" the social worker asked gently. The judge shook her head. "No," she said. "I need to do this myself." She picked up the envelope and carefully opened it. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the paper inside. She scanned the document, her eyes quickly finding the line that would change everything. The room was silent as the judge read the results. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt a wave of emotions crash over her. She looked up at the social worker, her eyes filled with tears. "It's him," she said, her voice breaking. "He's my son." The social worker smiled, her own eyes glistening with tears. "I'm so happy for you," she said. "For both of you." The judge sat down, her mind spinning. It was real. The boy she had thought about every day for so many years was really her son. And now, she had a chance to be a part of his life, to make up for all the time they had lost. But with that realization came a new set of challenges. She would need to figure out how to navigate this new relationship, how to balance her role as a judge with her role as a mother. And she would need to help her son adjust to this new reality, to help him understand what it all meant. As she left the social worker's office, the judge felt a sense of determination. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she was going to do everything in her power to give her son the life he deserved. The judge sat in her car outside the social worker's office, clutching the DNA test results in her hands. The words, "positive match," echoed in her mind, and she felt a flood of emotions she hadn't fully prepared for. Relief, joy, fear, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility all swirled together. She had found her son, after all these years. But now, the real work began. She took a deep breath and started the car. There was no time to waste. She needed to see him, to tell him the truth, and to start building the life they both deserved. As she drove to the foster home, her mind raced with thoughts of how to explain everything to him. How do you tell a child that the woman he just met in a courtroom is his mother? How do you make up for years of absence in a single conversation? When she arrived, the boy was in the backyard, playing with a small dog that belonged to the foster family. He looked up as she approached, his eyes widening in surprise. The judge knelt down to his level, her heart pounding. "Hey," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can we talk for a minute?" The boy nodded, his expression a mix of curiosity and nervousness. He followed her to a quiet spot under a tree, where they sat down together. The judge took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I got the results from the test," she began. "And it turns out that I am your mom." The boy stared at her, his eyes wide. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. "Really?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. The judge nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Really," she said. "I've been thinking about you every single day since you were born. And now, I finally get to be a part of your life." The boy's smile grew even wider, and he threw his arms around her in a tight hug. The judge hugged him back, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. It was as if a missing piece of her heart had finally been found. But the moment was bittersweet. The boy pulled back and looked at her, his expression turning serious. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. The judge's heart broke at the question. She had known it would come, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. "I was very young when you were born," she explained gently. "I wasn't able to take care of you the way you deserved. I wanted you to have a better life, so I made the hardest decision I've ever had to make. I gave you up for adoption, hoping that you would find a family who could give you everything I couldn't." The boy listened carefully, his eyes never leaving hers. "But you're here now," he said after a moment. "Yes," the judge said, her voice filled with emotion. "I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere. I promise." The boy nodded, seeming to accept her answer. He didn't say anything else, but he leaned against her, resting his head on her shoulder. The judge wrapped an arm around him, holding him close. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. Over the next few days, the judge and the boy spent as much time together as possible. They went to the park, played games, and talked about everything from his favorite animals to her job as a judge. The boy was curious about her life, and the judge was eager to learn everything she could about him. It was a slow process, but with each passing day, they grew closer. The judge also began the legal process of regaining custody of her son. It wasn't easy, there were court hearings, paperwork, and meetings with social workers, but she was determined to make it happen. She knew it would take time, but she was willing to do whatever it took to give her son the stable, loving home he deserved. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of the foster home, the boy turned to her and asked, "Will I live with you soon?" The judge smiled and ruffled his hair. "I hope so," she said. "We're working on it. But no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. You're my son, and I love you." The boy smiled back, his eyes shining with happiness. "I love you too, Mom," he said. The words filled the judge's heart with joy. She had waited so long to hear them, and now that she knew that everything she had been through, the pain, the guilt, the uncertainty, had been worth it. She had found her son, and together, they were starting a new chapter in their lives. But as happy as she was, the judge knew that there would still be challenges ahead. Her son had been through a lot, and it would take time for him to adjust to this new reality. She would need to be patient, understanding, and supportive as he navigated his feelings and learned to trust her. For now, though, she was content to simply be with him, to enjoy the moments they had together, and to look forward to the future. They had found each other, and that was all that mattered. The days turned into weeks, and the bond between the judge and her son grew stronger. They spent every possible moment together, slowly building the foundation of their new relationship. The boy, who had once been quiet and reserved, began to open up more. He laughed more often, asked more questions, and even started calling her Mom without hesitation. It was a small word, but it meant the world to her. The judge, for her part, did everything she could to make him feel safe and loved. She took him to the zoo, where he excitedly pointed out all the animals he wanted to learn more about. She helped him with his homework, patiently explaining math problems and reading stories together. She even bought him a sketchpad and colored pencils when she found out how much he loved to draw. His drawings were simple but full of imagination: dogs, trees, and even a picture of the two of them holding hands. But despite the joy they found in each other's company, there were still challenges. The boy had been through a lot in his short life, and it wasn't easy for him to trust completely. Sometimes, he would withdraw, his eyes clouded with memories of the past. Other times, he would get angry or frustrated, lashing out over small things. The judge knew it wasn't personal, it was his way of processing everything he had been through. She did her best to be patient, to listen, and to reassure him that she wasn't going anywhere. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, the boy sat on the floor of the foster home's living room, staring at the wall. The judge sat down beside him, giving him space but letting him know she was there. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked gently. The boy shook his head, but after a few moments, he spoke. "I don't want to leave here," he said quietly. The judge was surprised. She had assumed he would be excited about the possibility of living with her. "Why not?" she asked. The boy shrugged, his fingers tracing patterns on the carpet. "I like it here," he said. "The foster mom is nice. And the dog. Anne. I don't know. What if I don't like living with you?" The judge felt a pang of hurt, but she quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't about her, it was about him. That's okay, she said. It's normal to feel scared about something new. But I want you to know that no matter where you live, I'll always be your mom. And I'll always be here for you. The boy didn't say anything, but he leaned against her, resting his head on her shoulder. The judge wrapped an arm around him, holding him close. She knew it would take time for him to fully trust her, and she was willing to wait as long as it took. As the weeks went by, the legal process of regaining custody moved forward. The judge attended court hearings, met with social workers, and worked tirelessly to prove that she could provide a stable, loving home for her son. It wasn't easy, there were moments of doubt and frustration, but she refused to give up. She had already lost so much time with him, and she wasn't going to let anything stand in the way of their future together. One day, after a particularly long court hearing, the judge returned to the foster home to find the boy waiting for her on the porch. He ran up to her as soon as she got out of the car, his face filled with excitement. "Guess what?" he said, bouncing on his toes. "I drew a picture of us." The judge smiled and knelt down to his level. "Can I see it?" she asked. The boy handed her a piece of paper, and her heart melted as she looked at it. It was a drawing of the two of them standing in front of a house, holding hands. The sun was shining, and there were flowers and trees all around. At the bottom, in shaky letters, he had written, "Me and Mom." "It's beautiful," the judge said, her voice filled with emotion. "I love it." The boy beamed with pride. "I'm going to hang it on the fridge," he said. The judge laughed and ruffled his hair. "That's a great idea," she said. "It's going to be the first thing I see every morning." As they went inside, the judge felt a sense of hope and determination. They still had a long way to go, but they were making progress. Her son was starting to trust her, to see her as a permanent part of his life. And she was learning how to be the mother he needed, patient, understanding, and always there for him. That night, as she tucked him into bed, the boy looked up at her and said, "I'm glad you're my mom." The judge felt tears well up in her eyes, but she smiled through them. "I'm glad too," she said. "More than anything." As she turned off the light and closed the door, she knew that they were on the right path. They were building bridges, one step at a time, and nothing was going to stop them. The judge and her son continued to grow closer, but as their bond strengthened, the boy began to ask more questions about his past. He wanted to know about his biological father, about why he had been moved from one foster home to another, and about the life he might have had if things had been different. The judge knew these questions were inevitable, but answering them wasn't easy. She wanted to be honest with him, but she also didn't want to overwhelm him with too much information too soon. One afternoon, as they sat together in the park, the boy turned to her and asked, "What was my dad like?" The judge hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She had never spoken much about the boy's father, even to herself. It was a chapter of her life she had tried to leave behind. But she knew her son deserved to know the truth. "Your dad," she began, choosing her words carefully, "was someone I knew a long time ago. We were both very young, and we weren't ready to be parents. He wasn't a bad person, but he wasn't able to be there for you. I don't know where he is now, but I do know that he would be proud of you." The boy listened quietly, his brow furrowed in thought. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" he asked. The judge shook her head. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But even if he doesn't, you have me. And I'm not going anywhere." The boy nodded, seeming to accept her answer. But the judge could tell that he was still processing everything. She knew it would take time for him to come to terms with his past, and she was determined to support him every step of the way. As the weeks went by, the boy's behavior began to change. He became more withdrawn, more prone to outbursts of anger or sadness. The judge knew it was his way of dealing with everything he had been through, but it was hard to see him struggle. She reached out to a child psychologist, who suggested that the boy might benefit from therapy. The judge agreed, and they began attending sessions together. Therapy wasn't easy for the boy. At first, he was reluctant to talk, shutting down whenever the therapist asked him questions. But over time, he began to open up. He talked about his feelings of abandonment, his fear of being left alone, and his confusion about his identity. The judge listened, her heart breaking for him, but also feeling proud of his courage. One session, the therapist turned to the judge and said, "It's important for him to know that it's okay to feel angry or sad. He's been through a lot, and he needs to know that his feelings are valid." The judge nodded, taking the words to heart. That evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, she said to her son, "I want you to know that it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling. If you're angry, or sad, or confused, that's okay. You don't have to hide it from me." The boy looked at her, his eyes filled with emotion. "I just don't understand why everything had to be so hard," he said, his voice trembling. The judge reached out and took his hand. "I don't understand either," she said. "But what I do know is that we're here now, together. And we're going to figure it out, one step at a time." The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face. The judge pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly. She knew they still had a long way to go, but she also knew that they were making progress. They were facing the past together, and that was what mattered. As the weeks turned into months, the boy began to heal. He still had moments of anger and sadness, but they became less frequent. He started to smile more, to laugh more, and to trust more. The judge could see the change in him, and it filled her heart with hope. One day, as they were walking home from the park, the boy turned to her and said, "I'm glad you're my mom." The judge felt tears well up in her eyes, but she smiled through them. "I'm glad too," she said. "More than anything." As they walked hand in hand, the judge knew that they were on the right path. They were facing the past, but they were also building a future, together. The day finally arrived, the day the judge had been working toward for months. The court had granted her full custody of her son. It was a moment she had dreamed about, but now that it was here, she felt a mix of emotions. Excitement, relief, and a touch of nervousness all swirled together. She was about to bring her son home, to the life they would build together. The boy, however, was quieter than usual that morning. He sat on the edge of his bed in the foster home, his teddy bear clutched tightly in his arms. The judge knelt in front of him, her voice soft and reassuring. "Today's the day," she said, smiling. "You're coming home with me." The boy nodded, but his expression was uncertain. "What if I don't like it there?" he asked, his voice small. The judge's heart ached at the question. She had expected some hesitation, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real. "It's okay to feel nervous," she said. "New things can be scary. But I promise, we'll make it feel like home together. And if there's anything you don't like, we'll fix it. This is your home too now." The boy didn't say anything, but he stood up and grabbed his small bag of belongings. The judge took his hand, and together they walked out of the foster home for the last time. The foster mom waved goodbye, her eyes filled with tears, and the boy gave her a quick hug before climbing into the judge's car. The drive to their new home was quiet. The boy stared out the window, his thoughts clearly racing. The judge glanced at him occasionally, trying to gauge how he was feeling, but she didn't push him to talk. She knew he needed time to process everything. When they arrived at the house, the boy stepped out of the car and looked up at it with wide eyes. It wasn't a huge house, but it was warm and inviting, with a small garden in the front and a porch swing that swayed gently in the breeze. "This is it," the judge said, smiling. "Our home." The boy followed her inside, his eyes taking in everything, the cozy living room, the kitchen with its bright yellow walls, and the staircase that led to the bedrooms. The judge had worked hard to make the house feel welcoming, but she knew it would take more than furniture and paint to make it feel like home. She led him upstairs to his room, which she had decorated with his favorite color, blue. There was a bed with a spaceship comforter, a desk for drawing, and a bookshelf filled with books about animals and adventure. On the wall, she had hung the drawing he had made of the two of them. The boy stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with surprise. "This is my room?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. The judge nodded, her heart swelling with hope. "All yours," she said. "Do you like it?" The boy didn't answer right away. He walked into the room, running his hand over the desk and looking at the books on the shelf. Then he turned to her and said, "It's perfect." The judge felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I'm so glad," she said. "And if there's anything you want to change, just let me know. This is your space." The boy nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. For the first time since they had left the foster home, he seemed to relax. Over the next few days, they settled into their new routine. The judge took time off work to help her son adjust, and they spent their days exploring the neighborhood, playing games, and talking about everything from school to his dreams of becoming a veterinarian. The boy still had moments of uncertainty, but he seemed to be warming up to his new life. One evening, as they sat together on the porch swing, the boy turned to her and said, "I think I like it here." The judge smiled, her heart full. "I'm so glad," she said. "I like having you here too." The boy leaned against her, resting his head on her shoulder. "Do you think we'll always be together?" he asked. The judge wrapped an arm around him, holding him close. "Always," she said. "No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. You're my son, and I love you." The boy smiled, his eyes closing as he relaxed into her embrace. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe. He felt loved. And he felt like he was finally home. Life in their new home settled into a rhythm. The boy started school, made friends, and even joined a soccer team. The judge balanced her work at the courthouse with being a mom, and though it wasn't always easy, she wouldn't have traded it for anything. Every day, she watched her son grow a little more confident, a little more comfortable in his new life. But she also knew that healing wasn't linear. There were still moments when the weight of his past resurfaced. One evening, after a particularly rough day at school, the boy came home and slammed the door behind him. He threw his backpack on the floor and stormed up to his room without saying a word. The judge, who had been preparing dinner, paused and took a deep breath. She knew this wasn't about her, but about whatever he was carrying inside. She gave him a few minutes to cool down before knocking gently on his door. "Can I come in?" she asked. There was no answer, but she opened the door slowly and found him sitting on the bed, his arms crossed and his face red from crying. She sat down beside him, careful not to invade his space. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked softly. At first, he shook his head, but after a moment, he mumbled, "Everyone at school has a dad. Why don't I?" The judge's heart sank. She had known this question would come up again, but it didn't make it any easier to answer. She took a deep breath and said, "I know it's hard to see other kids with their dads. And I wish I could give you all the answers, but the truth is, I don't know where your dad is. What I do know is that you have me, and I'm never going to leave you. You're not alone, and you never will be." The boy didn't say anything, but he leaned against her, his tears soaking into her shirt. She held him tightly, letting him cry. She knew there were no words that could take away his pain, but she hoped that her presence could at least remind him that he was loved. Over time, the boy began to open up more about his feelings. Therapy helped, but so did the small, everyday moments, like when they cooked dinner together or when she cheered him on at his soccer games. Slowly but surely, he started to trust that she was there to stay. One weekend, the judge decided to take him on a trip to the mountains. It was a place she had always loved, and she thought it might be a good way for them to bond and create new memories. They hiked through the trails, laughed as they skipped stones across a lake, and roasted marshmallows over a campfire at night. As they sat under the stars, the boy turned to her and said, "This is the best day ever." The judge smiled, her heart swelling with love. "I'm so glad," she said. "You deserve all the best days." The boy looked at her, his eyes shining in the firelight. "I'm glad you're my mom," he said. "Even if it took a long time to find you." The judge felt tears well up in her eyes, but she didn't try to stop them. "I'm glad too," she said. "And I'm so proud of you. You've been through so much, but you're so strong. You're my son, and I couldn't be happier to have you in my life." The boy smiled, leaning against her as they stared up at the stars. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He knew that his life hadn't been easy, but he also knew that he had someone who loved him unconditionally. And that made all the difference. As the months turned into years, the judge and her son continued to build their life together. There were challenges, of course, homework struggles, teenage mood swings, and the occasional argument, but they faced them as a team. The boy grew into a kind, thoughtful young man, and the judge couldn't have been prouder of the person he was becoming. One day, as they sat together on the porch swing, the boy, now a teenager, turned to her and said, "Do you think we'll always be like this? You know, happy?" The judge smiled, her heart full. "Life isn't always going to be easy," she said. "But no matter what happens, we'll always have each other. And that's what matters." The boy nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I love you, Mom," he said. The judge felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't try to stop them. "I love you too," she said. "More than anything." As they sat there, swinging gently in the breeze, the judge thought about how far they had come. They had faced the past, built a home, and created a future together. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. They had found each other, and that was all that mattered.